The convoy came out of the dark, like something that had never needed a reason. Cale heard them before he saw them. A subsonic tremor that lived below hearing, more felt in the sternum than registered by any ear. He was on the water when it started. 200 meters out from the seawall, freediving for salvage in the shallower trenches, where the old city's bones still jutted up through the silt. The tremor traveled through the water and into his chest, and he surfaced already knowing what it meant. He'd heard it before, when he was 6, when his mother was still alive, and the world still had a name that wasn't just the zone, the Karath. He kicked toward the waterline and pulled himself up onto the crumbled breakwater. Rio was already standing at the edge, shoes off, watching the horizon to the north, where the sky had taken on that particular quality, flat bronze, almost amber, that preceded a Karath column. They both knew what the color meant. The Karath didn't broadcast. They didn't announce. They arrived, and then the zone you'd been living in got smaller. Counting lights, Rio said. His voice was flat, not afraid. Fear was a thing you spent fast, in the zone. You ran through your supply early, and then you had to learn to operate without it. And after enough years, what you were left with was something quieter and more functional. Not courage, exactly, just the absence of a reaction that had stopped being useful. Cale counted 2. 12 atmospheric landers, minimum. Maybe more behind the cloud base. They were moving south-southwest in a loose formation that would bring them over the northern sector of the zone in approximately 40 minutes. He'd learned to read their movements from 3 years of watching them. 3 years of understanding, by slow accumulation, which directions meant a sweep and which meant a transfer, and which meant something else entirely that it was better not to think about. This was a sweep. We should go, Cale said. We're always going, Rio said, and didn't move. That was Rio. 3 years living in the underbelt together, and Cale still couldn't predict whether any given moment would find his friend paralyzed by something. Cale couldn't see or vibrating with a ferocity that made everyone else in the room step back. The seizures were part of it, always had been, since before Cale had known him, since the accident or the exposure or whatever it was that had happened in those first days after the consolidation, that Rio didn't talk about. But the stillness was its own kind of seizure, internal, total, and just as impossible to interrupt by force. You waited. You stayed close. You made sure nothing bad reached him in the window while he was unreachable. And then you were there when he came back. Cale put a hand on Rio's shoulder, firm and without drama, and Rio came back. They ran. The underbelt was what the old mapping system still called Sector 7 Delta, a coastal zone of former industrial infrastructure that the Karath Occupation Authority had decided was not worth administering. Too toxic, too ruined, too difficult to extract any reliable value from. The industrial contamination had been there before the consolidation. Heavy metals in the water table, particulate matter in the air that gave everything a perpetual haze of yellow-brown, a coastline that had been dying for decades before the Karath arrived and accelerated the process. So the Karath left the zone, alone, and the humans who lived there were left alone too, provided they didn't accumulate enough to be noticed, provided they stayed in the ruins and scavenged for what they needed and didn't try to cross the wire. The wire was 2 kilometers north, a perimeter of Karath signal mesh that divided the zone from new settlement. What the Karath had built on the bones of the old city, after the consolidation, on the parts they deemed valuable, on the coastline that the industrial contamination hadn't reached. New settlement was clean. New settlement had light at night, and food you didn't have to find yourself, and air that didn't taste like old metal and brine. From certain points along the wire, you could see the towers, and sometimes at night, Cale would stand at the fence line and look at the towers for a while before making himself turn away, because looking too long at something you couldn't have was its own kind of poison. He and Rio had been living in the zone since they were 14, which was a span of time that felt, depending on the day, like either an eternity or the blink of something that was still happening. They'd met in the rubble. 3 days, in the immediate aftermath of a sweep that had taken most of their neighborhood, and the meeting had been less an introduction than a mutual discovery. Two kids in the same piece of collapsed infrastructure who had figured out independently that the only way to survive the next 72 hours was to share what they each had, which between them amounted to half a water purification tablet, one working flashlight, an intimate knowledge of the structural failure patterns of residential buildings, and a capacity for very still, very quiet waiting that most people their age hadn't yet developed. The 3 days ended. They stayed together. They lived, for the first year, the way most zone residents lived, scavenging, trading small items through the zone's informal networks, learning the rhythms of Karath, patrol schedules the way you learn the tides, not because you had any power over them, but because knowledge of patterns was the closest thing to power available. In the second year, they discovered the diving. The zone's coastline held the ruins of everything the old city had been. Industrial equipment, housing, the accumulated material record of several hundred years of human habitation, and most of it was underwater now, and most of it had no value, but some of it did. And the skill of finding the valuable pieces was a skill Kale had a particular aptitude for, a combination of spatial intelligence and controlled breath, and the ability to remain calm in dark, confined places, at depth that he couldn't fully explain, but that served him consistently. They'd lived on the barge for the last 18 months. The barge belonged to an old man named Greel, who had survived the consolidation through some combination of stubbornness, irrelevance, and a knack for being elsewhere when the Karath swept through. Greel was 80 at least, probably more. He never gave a number, and never seemed bothered by not giving one. He fished the contaminated water with a kind of meditative devotion that suggested he either didn't know about the contamination, or had decided it didn't apply to him. And he ate whatever he caught, and he never seemed sick from it. And he spoke rarely except to correct Kale, when Kale was wrong about something, which was often enough to be instructive, and rarely enough that each correction landed with real weight. He'd taken the boys in without ceremony. One morning they'd appeared at his pier, looking for temporary shelter from a patrol sweep, and Greel had looked at them for a moment with the expression of a man taking inventory, and then he'd said, "Stern cabin is empty," and that was the whole of the conversation. No terms, no obligations, no questions about who they were or where they'd come from. Just, the space is there, you can be in it. 3 years, and he'd never asked them for anything. The thing that had changed the shape of their lives, the reason KL had first made contact with the swarm, was a job, which was almost always how the significant things happened in the zone, because the significant things never announced themselves as such. They arrived looking like necessity. The swarm was the largest organized group in the underbelt. Not a gang exactly, though the old words applied close enough. They controlled the salvage routes, the black market exchanges, with the few settlements further inland, the flow of certain materials that had value in both the zone and new settlement. Their leader was a man called Ironhead, and Ironhead had a reputation that preceded him by about 3 seconds of silence whenever his name entered a room. Kale had heard the name for 2 years before he had any reason to seek the man out. He hadn't sought him out. He'd done a job, and doing the job had put him in front of a woman named Sangre, and Sangre had said Ironhead wanted to meet him, and that was how significant things happened. The job had been a theft, specifically the extraction of a Karath scanning unit from a processing depot at the edge of the zone's northern boundary. KL had been contracted through 2 intermediaries he'd never see again. He'd been told only that the equipment would be delivered to a buyer, and that the payment would be enough to cover 6 months of decent supply for 2 people. He wasn't told what the buyer wanted with it. He didn't ask. In the zone, the information you didn't ask for was often the information that was safest not to have. He'd done the job cleanly. He'd done it the way he did everything, with a minimum of complication, a maximum of patience, and the kind of attention to detail that came from 3 years of learning that in environments Where the cost of error was total, the only workable approach was thoroughness. When he'd delivered the unit to the drop point and found Sangra there, instead of the intermediary, he'd understood that the job had been an audition. "Ironhead wants to meet you," she said. She was measuring him. She did it openly, without pretending otherwise, which he respected. "Rio comes with me," he said. "Or I don't come." Sangra's measuring quality sharpened. "The one with the fits?" "Yes." She held the silence for a moment. He held it with her. He'd learned young that the moment you flinch when protecting something is the moment whatever you're protecting gets taken, and he'd had the relevant experience to understand it was true. He kept his face and his hands and his voice equally still. "Fine," Sangre said. Ironhead operated from a fortified complex in the deep interior of the zone, a former industrial processing plant, whose exterior was so thoroughly corroded and crumbling that from any distance it looked like every other ruin the zone offered, but whose interior had been reinforced, insulated, and fitted with power sources and communication systems that Cale couldn't immediately identify and found deeply impressive. The first time he walked through the entrance corridor and saw a working light panel overhead, he stopped for a moment and stared at it, and Sangre told him to keep moving, and he moved. Ironhead was in the central room that served as both office and operations center. He was a large man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a shaved head that caught the artificial light and held it, and a brow ridge that gave his face a permanent quality of assessment, as if everything he looked at was being weighed against some internal standard he never fully disclosed. He was sitting when they came in, and he didn't stand, and the sitting didn't feel like rudeness, but like a man who had no need to perform authority, because authority was simply the space he occupied. He looked at Cale for a long moment. He looked at Rio for a longer one. "Good job on the scanner," he said. "Thank you," Cale said. "It gives us new information about the northern sweep corridor. Kareth are adjusting their patrol schedule. We had 3 weeks. Now we have 4. He said this without apparent emotion. The way a man relays weather data. "Tell me how you got in and out without triggering the secondary sensor array." Cale told him. He told it accurately and completely, because if this was indeed an ongoing arrangement, then the value of the telling was higher than the value of keeping the methodology proprietary. Ironhead listened without interrupting, his eyes moving between Cale's face and the mental picture he was clearly building of the depot layout. When Cale finished, Ironhead said, "You went through the eastern maintenance corridor. Most people go around it. Going around it adds 6 minutes. The eastern corridor adds 2, but the sensor coverage is lower because of the interference from the water recycling units on the east wall. You tested this before the job. 3 separate reconnaissance passes over 2 weeks." Ironhead made a small sound that could have been appreciation or could have been recalibration. It was hard to tell. "I want you for extraction work," he said. "You have a talent for going into places you're not supposed to be and coming back from them. I need that talent on a regular basis." "Rio comes with the arrangement," Cale said. "That's the condition." "It's the only condition." Ironhead looked at Rio again with that measuring quality. Something moved behind his expression. Not hostility, not calculation exactly. Something with more nuance than either. "I know what he is," Ironhead said. "I've seen the condition before. I know what it means operationally." "Then you know he can work," Cale said. "I know he can work. I also know that a team member who can go down with no warning at a critical moment is a variable that I have to account for." He wasn't saying it as an accusation. He was saying it the way he said everything, as a fact to be processed. "I account for it," Cale said. "I've been accounting for it for 3 years. In 3 years, no clean operation has been compromised by it. I keep the operation running when he goes down. He comes back up, we continue." "That works for the 2 of you," Ironhead said. "It's a more complex equation when there are other people depending on the timeline." "I know," Cale said. "I adjust for the complexity. The condition stands." Another silence, longer than the first. Ironhead looked at Rio, who had been standing half a step behind Cale's left shoulder. his position, always, the particular geometry of how they moved in unknown spaces, and said nothing. Rio met the look without discomfort, which Cale noted, because Rio was not always easy under scrutiny. Then Ironhead nodded, once, and that settled it. The work was better than Cale had expected, and also harder in the ways that harder things are harder, which is not through difficulty alone, but through proximity to consequence. The swarm operated with an intelligence and discipline that was genuinely impressive. 60 people in the core group, moving with a collective decisiveness that made decisions faster than most individuals could, adapting to new information without the friction that came from unresolved internal debate, because Ironhead had built an organization in which the hierarchy was functional, rather than performative, and people, at every level, were trusted to execute within their competence. He'd been in other zone groups before, not organized at this scale. Nothing else in the zone was organized at this scale. But the informal collectives that zone life produced, the trade cooperatives, the neighborhood security arrangements, the temporary alliances that formed around specific threats and dissolved when the threat passed. Most of them had the same failure mode. The gap between what the group's leadership believed it was doing and what the group's membership believed it was doing. Ironhead had solved this by refusing to maintain the gap. The swarm knew its purpose. Everyone in it, from Sangre and the senior operators to the newest recruits at the network's edges, knew what they were building toward, because Ironhead had told them plainly, and kept telling them, not as inspiration or motivation, but as operational context. You need to know what you're part of, he'd said in the first full assembly Cale had attended. To make good decisions at the edge of it, surprises are a management failure. He'd said this last sentence, looking directly at himself, as if he was the primary person who needed to hear it. Cale's competence was infiltration and extraction. He was very good at it. 3 years of zone life had built something specific in him, a patience and an attention, and a particular quality of physical stillness that made him, in the environments where it mattered, nearly invisible. He learned the swarm's operational needs and adapted his approach to them, and over the first 3 months, he ran 7 operations without a failure, and 6 of those without a close margin. The operations themselves were various. Resource extraction from Karath logistics facilities at the zone's margins, intelligence gathering on patrol schedules and perimeter protocols. 2 operations that involved assisting zone residents who'd been flagged for detention to relocate before the flagging resulted in action. That last type of operation was the one Cale found he cared most about in the specific way you cared about things that had a face. The resource extractions and the intelligence work were important. He understood their place in the larger structure. But there was a woman named Dara, whom he'd helped move in the 2nd month, a schoolteacher who ran one of the zone's basement schools, and who had been identified by a Karath Monitoring's sweep as a potential organizer. She was 43 and had a deliberate precision about her that suggested she'd spent a long time teaching people things and had gotten very good at the patient explaining required to do it. When Cale had arrived at her school to tell her she needed to move immediately, she'd been in the middle of a lesson. She'd looked at him with the expression of someone who had been expecting this and had decided how to respond to it. She'd told the 15 children in the room to close their books and wait quietly, and then she'd pack the things she was going to take, the notebooks, not the personal items. And she'd walked out with Cale with the composure of a person who had already made her peace with the cost of what she was doing. He thought about Dara a lot during the planning phases of the larger operations. He thought about her and Vesper and the old man who ran the trade cooperative in the southeastern district, and the dozens of other people whose particular version of zone survival was not hiding or fighting, but building and teaching and maintaining the specific kind of stubborn investment in the continuation of things that could very easily have been abandoned. He thought about what Ironhead's plan meant for all of them, what it would mean for them to be on the other side of the wire. Rio, as Cale had told Ironhead, could work. When the intervals between seizures allowed it, when he was fully functional and present, he was extraordinary, sharp in a way that had nothing to do with formal training, and everything to do with a mind that processed threat information with unusual speed, capable of a focused and decisive physical response in close situations that had no relation to his slight frame. He'd saved Cale's life twice in the first month. Cale had not saved his in that same period, which was not because Cale hadn't tried, but because the situations that Ryo ended up in tended to resolve themselves before Cale could reach them. What changed gradually and then faster was Ryo's relationship to the violence. It was not that the violence itself changed. The zone required what it required, and the swarm's work, especially the more direct actions against Karath logistics and perimeter infrastructure, involved the kind of confrontation that demanded a capacity for it. Cale had no illusions about this. He understood, clearly and without sentiment, that the world he lived in had certain demands that the world he might have lived in some other history, would not have had. He could meet those demands. He met them as tools, as requirements, as the cost of specific outcomes he was trying to produce. What he watched in Ryo was something different. An ease, a quickness in the eyes during direct action that looked less like necessity accepted and more like preference revealed. Not cruelty, that wasn't the word, and using it would have been unfair and imprecise. More like a place where Ryo fully inhabited himself, where the rest of the complexity of being Ryo fell away, and something simple and absolute remained. It worried Cale in a way he couldn't fully articulate, which meant he spent a lot of time looking at it sideways rather than directly. The situation that made him look at it directly was an operation 4 months into their time with the swarm. A secondary mission, not major, accompanying a larger team to the eastern border sector to gather intelligence on a new Karath monitoring installation. They weren't supposed to make contact. The operation was reconnaissance, clean in and out. The contact happened anyway, as it sometimes did, when a Karath mobile patrol passed through the area on a schedule that hadn't appeared in any of the intelligence they'd worked from. Cale had pulled back into cover when the patrol came over the ridge. 3 other team members pulled back with him. Ryo pulled back too, initially, and then the patrol's course brought 1 unit within 6 meters of a team member who'd been unable to reach cover in time. A young man named Brace, who'd been with the swarm for 8 months, and who was now pressed against a piece of collapsed infrastructure, while a Karath unit moved within arm's reach. Ryo had moved before anyone could stop him. What followed lasted 11 seconds, and ended with the Karath unit no longer functioning and Ryo standing over it, with his breathing elevated and his hands completely steady, and something in his face that Cale could read, and that made the back of his neck go cold. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something that was its own category. Something that was about the 11 seconds themselves, not about the outcome they'd produced. They got out clean. Brace owed Ryo his continued existence. In the debrief, Ironhead had said nothing about the deviation from plan, though he'd looked at Ryo for a long moment, and then looked at Cale, and Cale had understood that the look was asking something. He didn't have an answer for it yet. 3 months later, they were called in for a private meeting with Ironhead about a significant new intelligence package. The meeting had the quality of an escalation. Ironhead only briefed privately when the information was either too sensitive for the full group or too large to be absorbed except in smaller doses. This was both. The intelligence had come through the swarm's wider network, which Cale had come to understand extended much further than the zone itself, into new settlement through human workers with access, into the Karath administrative systems, through a collection of carefully maintained technical vulnerabilities, and outward through a web of zone-adjacent settlements that Ironhead had been cultivating for years. What it described was a Karath logistics hub near the wire, not inside new settlement, but close enough to feel like it, in the buffer zone between the wire and the settlement's outer boundary, that housed power cells, medical fabrication units, and, Most critically, 3 Kareth data archive modules. According to the intelligence, those modules contained the operational records of every human detention facility within 200 kilometers of the zone. Locations, population numbers, transfer schedules, facility staff rotations, Ironhead said. If we have this, we can move on the facilities. We can start getting people out. The weight of this was different from other briefings. 9,000 people, the current estimate, held in facilities whose locations none of the zone's resistance networks had been able to fully verify. For 3 years, the effort had been building toward having enough information to actually act. This was the information. The modules are in the hub's tertiary storage, Ironhead said. The hub has a security complement of 6 units and 2 automated sensor arrays. The eastern perimeter array is the more vulnerable. Its newer equipment and newer equipment interfaces in predictable ways. If you know what to look for. He was looking at Rio when he said this. Rio understood immediately. A frequency disruption, he said. 4 minutes of blind grid, Ironhead said. 3 emitters wired together, set up at 50 meters from the array. You'd have to hold the position for the full 4 minutes, then extract on a pre-programmed course. I've done closer, Rio said. Not for 4 minutes, Ironhead said. Rio was quiet for a moment. Then, what's the seizure protocol if I go down at the position? It was the right question to ask, and the fact that he asked it, rather than dismissing the risk, told Kale something had shifted slightly in how Rio was thinking about the operation, a more careful accounting. The position has cover on 3 sides, Ironhead said. If you go down, the emitters are on a timer. The 4-minute disruption completes without you holding anything. You hold cover. You stay down. You extract after. Rio looked at Kale. I need to know you'll stay down, Kale said. I know, Rio said. I need to hear it. A beat. I'll stay down. The planning took 2 weeks. Kale ran through the operation every night before sleep, finding the places where it could fail, building contingencies for each one, adjusting and readjusting the sequence until it ran clean in his head at least a dozen times from start to finish. The hub's floor plan came from the archive intelligence and a physical reconnaissance that he ran himself 2 nights before the operation, lying in the dirt 50 meters from the hub's southern wall for 3 hours, while he mapped the patrol pattern and verified the sensor array positions. On the final evening before the operation, with the planning finished and nothing remaining to do but let the plan exist and try to sleep, he and Rio were sitting on the deck of Greel's barge. The old man was below. The zone's perpetual yellow-brown dark was doing what it always did, and the contaminated water was lapping at the hull in the slow rhythmic way that K.A.L. had come to find, despite everything. Calming. If you go down, K.A.L. said, you stay down, you wait for the reset, you don't move. I know, Rio said. Not like the Eastern Sector incident. That was a choice. I understand why you made it. And I'm not relitigating it. I'm saying, at this position, if you go down, the emitters run without you, and the 4 minutes complete. Staying down is the right call. And it's also the safe call. And I need you to choose it. Rio turned the piece of corroded metal he'd picked up from the deck, railing over in his fingers, looking at it. Then he said, without looking up, do you know why I don't stay down? Tell me. When I come out of one, Rio said, there are about 30 seconds when everything is very clear, before the headache. Before everything comes back at full weight, there's just this window where it all goes quiet and clean, and I can do anything. And if there's a fight happening, and I come up in that window, I don't want to waste it. Kale looked at him. He understood this. He understood it in a way that made him sad, in a way he didn't examine closely, because examining it closely would have required him to sit with the fact that Rio's 30-second window was the only place. Rio experienced clarity, and that was a thing about Rio's life that Kale couldn't fix and didn't want to be in the habit of sentimentalizing. Save the window, he said. Save it for when we need it most. Rio looked at the metal in his hands. What if the window is the only thing I have to offer? It isn't, Kale said. Rio didn't look convinced, but he nodded. In the morning, Greel was gone. Not gone in the way of someone who had left, gone in the way of someone who had stayed entirely, in the most permanent sense. He was in his chair at the stern, as he always was in the morning, and Cale brought him his cup and found that the old man had passed sometime in the night, quietly in his chair, with the expression he always wore. The expression of a man who had watched a long time and found most of what he'd watched inevitable. His hands were in his lap. His face was composed. He looked, Cale thought, like a man who had arrived at the answer he'd been working toward for decades, and found it satisfying. Ryo stood in the doorway of the stern cabin and said nothing for a long time. Cale stood beside the chair and also said nothing, because there was nothing that improved the moment, and the long zone habit of staying with things until they became bearable rather than rushing past them was, at least in this, the right approach. He never asked us anything, Ryo finally said. No, Cale agreed. He never wanted anything from us, just let us be here. Yes. Ryo was quiet again. Then, that was the whole thing. That was the whole thing about him. Cale picked up the crucifix from the ledge where it lived when they weren't diving. The corroded copper, steel piece they'd found on their first week, worked in a shape that was almost the old human religious symbol, and might have been something else entirely. But that had been with them since the beginning, and had therefore become what it was through use. He placed it around Greel's neck. It seemed right. It seemed like the most honest tribute available, giving back the thing you'd been keeping safe. They made the arrangements through the swarm's network, because the zone had its rights, and Greel had lived in it long enough to deserve them, and then they went to do the operation. The window opened at 0220. Ryo hit the eastern perimeter array at 0222, and the grid went dark. Cale was already inside. He moved through the hub's interior corridors, with the speed of someone who had memorized the route to the point where his body knew it without active direction. The access credential was clean. The security complement was running its standard rotation, which he'd verified through the reconnaissance, and which held. The power cells were in the secondary storage bay. The extraction team under Sangre was handling those. The medical fabrication unit was with them. Cale went straight for the tertiary storage, 2 security seals. The archive credential he'd spent 3 weeks acquiring opened both. He pulled the 3 data archive modules, sealed them in the electromagnetic bag, and was back in the main corridor in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Sangre's voice in his ear. We have a problem. The problem was a Kareth patrol unit that hadn't been on any schedule they'd mapped. Not a regular patrol, not a transfer. Something new, possibly a random insertion in response to the recent facility extraction, or simply a procedural change that hadn't made it into the intelligence yet. The unit was moving through the facility from the western access, between the extraction team and their exit. Cale was already moving before she finished describing it. He went through the patrol route rather than around it, because around it added time they didn't have. The first unit he handled with a frequency emitter that disrupted its sensory lattice for 6 seconds. 6 seconds was enough to pass. The second unit he passed, in a maintenance crawl space, that the patrol units were architecturally incapable of accessing. The third unit was in the exit corridor, with no crawl space option and no frequency emitter left. He pressed against the side wall of the corridor junction and held absolutely still. The zone had given him this, the ability to become part of the architecture, to stop being a moving thing in space and become instead a static element of the environment, indistinguishable from the rusted metal and old pipe insulation and dark corners that the zone offered in infinite supply. The unit moved through the corridor. It passed within 3 meters. Its sensory apparatus was formidable in open space and nearly useless in tight geometry with the electromagnetic interference that the hub's own equipment generated. A fact Cale had verified over 2 years of careful study, because understanding the geometry of Kareth perception was the most important survival knowledge available. The unit passed. He rejoined the extraction team at 225. The 3 modules were in the bag against his chest. Sangra counted them out of the hub at 0226, with 37 seconds to spare before the grid came back up. Rio was at the fallback position, exactly where he was supposed to be, sitting on a piece of collapsed barrier with his arms on his knees, breathing measured, looking at the ground in the particular way he looked at things when he was coming down from elevated state. When Kale came over the rise and saw him, he felt the thing he always felt in that moment, a loosening in his chest that had been tight since they'd separated. Clean? Rio said. Secondary auth layer had changed. Spent 8 extra minutes on the tertiary access. The modules? Reels. Kale patted the bag. Rio exhaled once, slow. You? Kale said. Rio held up 3 fingers, their shorthand. Episodes all held, all managed. It was a high number for one operation. You should have told me it was running that high, Kale said. You were inside. What would you have done with the information? Adjusted the exit timeline. The exit timeline was already tight. I know. I would have found time. Rio looked at him. Something passed behind his eyes. Something that was an argument, but that was sitting with the argument. Okay, he said. Next time I tell you. They sat together on the concrete for a while. The zone's night moved around them in its amber quality. To the north, new settlements' lights made their familiar glow on the underside of the haze. Kale had stopped looking at those lights long ago, or he'd thought he had. But tonight he looked at them and thought about what the archive modules in the bag against his chest might mean. If the intelligence was accurate and the locations were real, and Ironhead's plan was everything. Ironhead seemed to believe it was. 3,000 and more people in facilities they now knew the locations of. Starting was what mattered. He picked himself up. They walked back together. Ironhead's tech team took 3 days with the modules. What came out of them was significant enough that Ironhead called the full assembly of the Swarm's core group. All 60, which was rare, which meant the news was the kind that needed to be held by everyone simultaneously, rather than distributed through the network's normal channels. 9 facilities. Not the 6 the intelligence estimates had suggested. 9, covering a geographic area larger than any of them had mapped, with a combined detainee population that the archive records put at somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000, depending on the date of the most recent data entries. One of the 9 was inside New Settlement itself, which was new information, which landed in the assembly room, with the particular weight of things that have been suspected and are now confirmed. Ironhead said the numbers and let them sit. We can't move on all 9 simultaneously, he said. We don't have the resources or the coordination infrastructure. Not yet. But we can move on the nearest 3, and the nearest 3 will build what we need for the remaining 6. He looked around the assembled group with that quality he had. Not inspiration. Exactly, not the performed version of leadership that Kale had encountered in other places. Something more like a man who genuinely believed what he was saying and had been waiting for the moment when the evidence allowed him to say it. Starting is what matters, he said. Kale had heard these words from him before, in various contexts. Each time they carried the same weight. Not optimism, which was a feeling, but a commitment, which was a choice. The difference was significant. In the days that followed the assembly, Kale spent a lot of time thinking about the specific shape of what Ironhead had described. Not the operational shape. He understood that well enough, and the planning would take care of the rest. The human shape. The 60,000 people who lived in the zone, and who had been living in the zone for a decade, and who had in that decade done what human beings did, built things. Not grand things, not things that would survive a structural survey or impress anyone arriving from outside. But things. Networks of exchange and care and knowledge, informal schools that ran in basements, and corroded warehouses where adults who remembered the old world taught children who'd never known it the things that seemed worth preserving. Mathematics, language, history, music, the particular stubborn human insistence that the record of what had been should survive into whatever was coming. Repair shops that fixed things the Karath had never designed with repair in mind, because the zone's people had learned that nothing could be discarded because there was no replacement available. And so everything was extended through improvisation and the inventive application of materials not originally intended for any given purpose. Medical practices built from salvage and memory, and the slow exchange of knowledge between the zone's few trained practitioners and the many people who needed what they knew. He thought about a woman named Vesper, who ran a medical station out of a converted filtration building in the zone's eastern sector. He'd been to her station twice for injuries sustained in operations. Rio had been 4 times, twice for seizure-related complications, and twice for combat injuries. Vesper was in her 50s and had been a surgeon in the old world, and had, after the consolidation, converted that training into whatever form it could take in a zone medical station that had no reliable supply chain and no sterile environment and no support structure beyond what she improvised. She worked 16-hour days. She had a waiting room that was always full. She kept notes in handwritten notebooks, scores of them, stacked and organized with a precision that looked, in the context of everything around it, almost absurd, but that Vesper herself clearly did not find absurd. The notes were the record. The record was what survived. He'd asked her once, sitting in her examination space while she cleaned a gash in his arm, what she thought about the zone. Not what she thought about their situation, which was a question he asked everyone, and which produced the predictable range of answers. What she thought about the zone itself. The place. She'd thought about it for a moment, working with the efficient economy of motion that long practice produced. I think it produced people, she said. Not better people than existed before, necessarily, but people who've been through a process that clarifies. Like a reduction sauce, you take something complex and you cook off most of what was in it, and what's left is more concentrated. He'd thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about it now, sitting with the Assembly's news and the scale of what Ironhead was proposing and what it meant that the concentrated thing, the zone's reduced and clarified version of its 60,000 people, was about to make contact with the world on the other side of the wire. What the Karath would make of that contact. What the zone's people would make of it. What would come next was a thing he didn't fully understand yet. He knew the operational steps. He knew the planning. He didn't know what it meant to stop being zone people and become something else. People who had come from the zone, who carried the reduction inside them, who were now in a world that hadn't been through the same process. He thought about Rio. He thought about the treatment protocol and the lengthening intervals, and what it meant that the medical dimension of their 3 years together was moving toward a different shape. He understood Rio's logic, the logic of not wanting KL to carry hope for something that might not hold. He understood it with the precision of someone who had spent 3 years inside the specific texture of what Rio's condition meant, who knew the difference between a 30-second interval and a 60-second one. Not as data, but as lived time, the particular quality of the minutes before, and the minutes after, and the specific practice of being present through all of them. What he didn't yet know how to say to Rio was this. The thing that the treatment protocol changed was the intervals. It didn't change what the intervals had produced. 3 years of working around an unpredictable variable in high-stakes conditions had built something that wasn't about the variable. It was about the people on either side of it. You didn't build the kind of operational fluency they had by working around a problem. You built it by becoming so thoroughly acquainted with every dimension of each other's functioning that the problem was just one piece of a larger picture, and the larger picture was what mattered. He didn't know how to say this yet. He would find the right moment. The planning for the 3 detention facility operations occupied the next 2 weeks. Kale was led on the closest, a transit processing center 60 kilometers inland, where the archive data put the current population at somewhere between 300 and 400 detainees. He knew what Karath transit processing meant. He'd known since the 2nd year in the zone, when a woman in the northern sector had told him what she'd seen in the facility, where they'd held her for 6 months before releasing her for what she assumed were arbitrary reasons. He didn't like carrying the knowledge. He'd found that the most useful thing to do with it was to let it become fuel rather than weight. While the planning progressed, the shift he'd been watching in Rio became harder to look at sideways. The first sign had been in the planning sessions themselves. Rio had begun, subtly but consistently, to direct his tactical input toward Ironhead rather than Kale, not undermining Kale, not contradicting, just repositioning his orientation. Where he had instinctively turned to Kale for decision confirmation, he now turned to Ironhead. Kale noted it and didn't say anything, because noting a thing and reacting to it immediately were different acts, and it wasn't yet clear which one the situation required. The second sign was a conversation he came upon accidentally. 3 days into the planning, he turned a corner in the safe house corridor and found Rio and Sangre in low, focused conversation that stopped when they saw him. Sangre nodded and walked on. Rio met his eyes with the particular quality of someone who has been caught doing something that isn't quite wrong but requires explanation. "What was that?" Kale said. "Tactical discussion," Rio said. "About what?" "Your approach to the transit facility. Whether extraction first is the optimal priority, or whether taking the administrative systems before moving the people is higher value." Kale looked at him steadily. "The administrative systems take an additional 6 to 8 minutes. That's 6 to 8 more minutes of exposure for the entire operation." "I know," Rio said. "Why are you having this conversation with Sangre instead of me?" A pause, slight. "Because Sangre has Ironhead's ear in a way that gives tactical input more weight when it comes through her. If you and I agree on something, that doesn't change the operational order. If Sangre agrees, the calculus is different." KL held this. The logic was sound. The zone didn't reward sentimentality about operational process. You used the channels that worked, and Rio was right that Sangre's recommendation carried weight with Ironhead in a way that theirs didn't yet. "But next time," Kale said, "you talk to me first, before you take it anywhere else." "Okay," Rio said, and the ease of it, the smoothness with which he moved past the moment, was itself the thing that troubled Kale most. Not resistance, but the absence of any friction, as if the conversation had already been had internally. And Kale's version of it was a formality. 4 days before the transit facility operation, Ironhead came to find Kale at the outer wall of the processing plant compound, where Kale was standing in the zone's night, with no particular purpose, except to be outside his own head for a while. Ironhead stood beside him, and they watched the sky do what it did. That quality of amber-brown haze that the old people said had replaced the black sky they remembered from before the consolidation. "Rio is good," Ironhead said. "Yes," Kale agreed. "He's going to be something exceptional, if the treatment protocol holds." "I didn't know about the treatment protocol," Kale said. His voice stayed level. This was a discipline he'd developed, the keeping level, because level voices created space and raised voices closed it, and he needed space for this conversation. Ironhead paused. "He hasn't told you." Another pause. Then, he wanted to see whether it was working before raising it. "Didn't want you to." Ironhead stopped. Started again. "He said he didn't want you to be carrying hope for him when it might not hold." Kale stood with this. He turned it over. "How is it working?" he said. "Well, the team thinks within 3 months the intervals could be extended enough to functionally eliminate the operational risk." "Good," Kale said. He meant it absolutely. He also felt the full weight of what he was meaning, the way a thing can be entirely right and also cost something. And both of those facts can be true simultaneously, without either canceling the other. What he understood was this. Rio was building a future self. A self that didn't have the seizures at its center. A self that didn't require the management and the coverage and the particular kind of attention that Kale had been providing for 3 years. In that future self, the role that Kale occupied, the person who knew the intervals and the tells and the recovery patterns better than Rio knew them himself, became smaller, became background, became eventually unnecessary. And Rio, who had always been too intelligent to miss implications, had seen this coming and hadn't known what to do with it, and so he had done what people do with things they don't know how to handle. He had put distance between himself and the person the change most affected. Cale understood it completely. He also understood that Rayo was wrong about what the change meant. He decided to wait for the right moment to say so. The transit facility operation went cleanly for 18 minutes. The ingress route held. The administrative system extraction, Ironhead's priority, incorporated into the operational order after Cale had accepted it as the right call, even though the process of arriving at it had been lateral rather than direct, ran on schedule. The detainee block access was achieved cleanly, and then the doors opened. Cale had known the numbers. He had studied the archive data thoroughly. He had understood, intellectually, that 347 people in a Karath transit facility would be in varying states of deterioration, that the duration of their detention would have costs, that the faces he'd find would not be the faces of people who'd been waiting comfortably. None of the intellectual preparation had prepared him for the physical reality. The faces. That was what caught him. Not the conditions, which were bad, but not beyond what he'd imagined, but the faces, which were something specific and human, and present in a way that data entries couldn't carry. 347 individual people who had each, separately, been waiting, who had each, in the hours and days and weeks of waiting, done the particular human thing of building some small internal structure to wait inside of, some story about when the door opened, some maintenance of self that the zone's particular damage hadn't fully stripped away. He watched them see the door open and watched the small structures they'd built absorb the shock of it being real. He'd planned for slow movement. He'd built the operational timing around it. He hadn't planned for what happened at minute 19. Rio had been assigned to the secondary access point, which was one of the two critical choke points in the extraction route. He was there when the alarm triggered, a monitoring unit that one of the swarm team members had failed to fully neutralize, which was not negligence, but the particular kind of error that happens when you've moved through 8 correct steps and your attention thins on the 9th. The alarm called a response team from the facility's security complement. The response team moved toward the primary access route. Ryo, at the secondary access point, could see this on his tactical display. He could see that the primary route would be compromised in approximately 90 seconds. Move to intercept. Cale heard Sangri's voice in his earpiece. Rio's designation code, her tone carrying the quality of tracking something she didn't like. He heard Rio's clipped response. Operational, already committed. He couldn't break off from the 300-person movement to redirect. Any disruption to the flow caused cascading stops, and they were already compressing against the timeline. He said Rio's name once in the earpiece. That was all. I have it, Rio said. What happened at the secondary access point stopped the Karath response team completely. 6 minutes of functional incapacity, which was exactly what the operation needed to complete the primary extraction. KL would read the full tactical account later, in the debrief, and it would describe what Rio had done in the precise, neutral language that the swarm used for debrief accounts, and the precision of the language would do very little to hide what the account was actually describing, which was Rio operating at the edge of what the swarm's people were capable of individually, and making it look inevitable. The extraction completed. 347 people came out of the facility. The administrative systems were cracked. The swarm lost one team member, a man named Fulcrum, who died covering the eastern fallback route with professionalism and a quietness that said everything about who he'd been, and nothing about it being worth it, and everything about it being necessary, and both of those things being simultaneously true, and there being no resolution to that. In the fallback safe house, after the detainees had been processed into the wider network, and the team had debriefed, Kale found Ryo sitting alone against the outer wall of a supply room, in the particular quality of alone that followed operations like this one. He sat down beside him, They didn't speak for a while. The secondary access point, Kale said. I made the right call. Not defensive, factual. Probably, Kale agreed. You made it without me. There wasn't time to consult. There was time for one word in the earpiece. Rio looked at the floor. You were moving 300 people. I wasn't going to add to your cognitive load at a critical moment. That's Sangre's calculus, Kale said. I recognize it because I've heard her use it. Give me yours. A long pause. The ambient sounds of the safe house moved through the wall between them. I knew what I could do, Rio said finally. I knew the response team couldn't adapt to it in the time available. I was the right tool for the problem, and there wasn't time to build agreement around it. And if you'd gone down in the middle of it? Rio didn't answer immediately. The treatment protocol, Kale said. The intervals are longer. I've had 3 consecutive weeks without. You didn't tell me, Kale said, quiet, not angry, just placing it where it needed to be. 3 years we've managed the intervals together. You changed the protocol without telling me, Ironhead told me. Rio was still. He shouldn't have, Rio said. He did because he thought I knew, Kale said, because it seemed like the kind of thing I'd know. Because in 3 years, it's been the kind of thing I've known. Rio said nothing. Why didn't you tell me, Kale said. Not a question, the shape of one. A long silence. Long enough that Kale felt it as a physical texture, something with weight and temperature. Because if the treatment works, Rio said, I'm not the problem anymore, and I didn't know what we were if I wasn't the problem. Kale looked at him. If I don't need covering, Rio said. If there's no window to manage, if I'm just operational, functional, no variable, then I didn't know what was left, for us, for what we are. He said the last 4 words quietly, and they landed quietly, in the space where the 3 years of the particular shape of them lived. Kale sat with this for a moment. Then he said, You think that's what it was? Managing the problem, wasn't it? No, Kale said, flat and clear, not gentle but not harsh. It was the shape of us. You think the shape of us is just the medical logistics? Rio looked at him. We're good at different things, Kale said. We always were, before the zone, before the swarm, before any of this. The intervals are one of the things we work around. Not the foundation of it, not the reason for it. He let this settle before continuing. You've been redirecting toward Ironhead, talking to Sangre before me, running operational decisions without me in the loop. That's not you becoming more functional. That's you trying to become a version of yourself that doesn't need what we built. Rio was very still. And I understand why, Kale said. I understand exactly why. But you're wrong about what you'd be giving up. You're wrong about what the shape of us actually is. He let the silence hold after that because the thing he'd said needed room to land without being pushed. After a while, Rio said, Okay. It was 2 syllables, and it was also everything. Okay, Kale said. It wasn't resolved. Nothing like this resolved in a single conversation, and pretending otherwise would have been dishonest to both of them. But it was begun, and beginning was what mattered. The weeks after the transit facility operation were weeks of accumulation. Accumulation of people, of capability, of intelligence, and of Karath attention. The extraction of 347 detainees had not gone unnoticed. It couldn't have. The Karath investigation into zone-based organized groups had intensified, and the swarm's security monitoring was picking up indicators of systematic analysis. The kind of methodical narrowing that preceded a decisive response. Ironhead briefed this with the same steadiness he brought to all data. They're going to try to identify us through recent additions to the network, he said. And he did not look at Kale and Rio, which meant he was specifically and deliberately not doing so, which meant the thought had been there, and he decided to set it aside. We segment, we move, and we accelerate the primary plan. The primary plan had existed in outline since before Kale had joined the swarm. Ironhead had been building toward it for 3 years, not rushing it, not forcing it before the conditions existed, because premature execution of a plan, this scale was more dangerous than no plan at all. What the detention facility intelligence had provided was the final structural element. The Karath's regional logistics network was coordinated from a single central node, a facility that managed supply chains, detention transfers, construction procurement, and the maintenance scheduling for the signal mesh perimeter. That node was vulnerable in a specific way, at a specific point in its maintenance cycle, to a disruption that would trigger a diagnostic cascade across the entire northern perimeter grid. The diagnostic cascade would take the grid offline. The wire would come down, not permanently, not everywhere, along a 40-kilometer stretch of the northern boundary for a window of 12 to 24 hours, long enough for 60,000 zone residents to know it was down and to choose what to do with that knowledge. "They'll close it," Sangre said, "when they realize what's happened." "Yes," Ironhead said. "That's why the people need to already be moving before the wire goes down. The wire going down is the signal. The real operation is the 48 hours before." He looked around the room. They can close the wire. They cannot unmove 60,000 people who have already moved. The scale of this was different from anything Kale had planned for. He spent several hours after the briefing sitting with the dimensions of it. Not the tactical dimensions, which were complex but comprehensible, but the human dimensions. 60,000 people making a decision. 60,000 people choosing. The zone had spent 10 years as a space where choice had been reduced to its most minimal form. You could choose how to survive, in what sequence and combination to deploy the limited resources available, how to position yourself relative to the Karath's patterns of attention. The choice of whether to leave had not been available. He thought about Ironhead's observation about the Karath's fundamental vulnerability, their inability to model a species that absorbed loss at this scale and kept functioning. He thought about what it would look like from inside the Karath's analytical systems when 60,000 beings chose simultaneously to walk through a gap in a wire. He thought about the null result, the variable returning no recognized output, the failure mode of a system that had never encountered what it was encountering. The 48 hours before the wire operation were the most sustained and complex execution Kale had ever been part of. The swarm's 200-person network moved through the zone in coordinated cells, seeding information through every channel that existed. Salvage route networks, black market contacts, neighborhood structures, the informal systems that human beings built wherever they were left long enough to build them, because the building of them was apparently non-negotiable, regardless of conditions. The message was simple. Simplicity was necessary because it had to travel fast and arrive undistorted. At a specific signal, on a specific night, a specific section of wire would come down. Be at this location with what you can carry. Kale ran 4 coordination routes in those 48 hours. He slept 6 hours total across both days. He ate when someone handed him something and didn't think about it. He moved through the zone with the efficiency of someone whose map of it was thorough enough to be instinctive, navigating by feel through the places he'd been navigating for 3 years, passing through the neighborhoods that had been neighborhoods before the consolidation and that still held some quality of having been neighborhoods, even in their current form. Something in the arrangement of the ruins, the way people had organized around the remaining structures, the small persistent marks that humans left on spaces they inhabited. In the second of the 48 hours, in the deep part of the night, he stopped for a moment in a part of the zone he'd been through hundreds of times, an old residential sector in the central district, where the original buildings had collapsed into each other and been reinforced over the 10 years since the consolidation into new structures that weren't the buildings they'd started as, but were stable, habitable, occupied. People had lived here continuously for a decade. The Karath had never cared to remove them because there was nothing here worth removing, no resource of interest, no strategic position, just people in rebuilt ruins who had, over 10 years, made those ruins into something that functioned as a neighborhood. He stood for a moment and looked at it. The particular quality of habitation, the small signs that said people slept here, ate here, came home here at the end of days, that had required everything they had. A child's drawing on a section of wall, faded by weather but still visible, something that might have been a sun or a face or both. A collection of small objects arranged on a windowsill with the intentionality of someone who had decided that this arrangement meant something, even if the meaning was entirely private. The smell of cooking from somewhere nearby, specific enough to identify at least 2 spices, which meant someone had access to spices, which meant the trade networks were functioning, which meant the zone's informal economy was doing what it always did, finding a way. He thought about the Karath analysts running their models of the zone. He thought about what those models included and what they left out. The models certainly included population estimates, resource consumption data, threat category assessments. They probably included quality of life metrics of some kind, calibrated to whatever the Karath used as reference points. What they almost certainly didn't include was the drawing on the wall, or the windowsill collection, or the smell of 2 specific spices in the middle of a sector that any outside observer would describe as a ruin. The things that told you what a place actually was, the things that couldn't be captured in any model built by a species that didn't understand why you'd bother. He moved on. There was work to do. Rio ran 3 routes. They coordinated over the earpiece network in the clipped, precise shorthand of people who had been communicating in high-stakes situations long enough that the language had become compressed to its essential elements. No elaboration, no confirmation request beyond what was necessary. Just position and problem and solution, running at the speed of the situation. It was the purest form of the thing between them, stripped of everything that wasn't functional, running on what remained, which turned out to be substantial. In the second night, during a brief overlap between his 3rd and 4th routes, Kale passed Rio at a junction point near the zone's western edge. They had 40 seconds. Rio looked steady, not the elevated quality that preceded an episode, just present and clear and moving at the right speed. "How many?" Kale said. "1," Rio said. 40 minutes ago, short. "You're good. I'm good." A pause, the length of a breath. "Kale, yeah." Rio looked at him with something that was partly the compression of 48 operational hours, and partly something he'd been carrying, separately. "When this is done." "After," Kale said. "After," Rio agreed. They went their separate directions into the dark. The zone moved around them, its 60,000 people doing the particular thing they'd been doing for 10 years. Persisting, building, maintaining the small structures that the Karath's models didn't have room for, getting ready. In the final hours before the operation, they found themselves briefly at the staging area, at the old customs pier. The barge was moored 50 meters out. They both looked at it. "I keep thinking about the crucifix," Rio said. "We left it with him," Kale said. That was right. I know. But I keep thinking about it." Kale understood. The crucifix had been the first thing they'd found together. First morning, first week, first dive. A piece of worked metal that had spent years in the ocean and retained, in its corroded state, something of the shape it had started with. They'd kept it because it was theirs. Because keeping things that survived the ocean without losing their essential shape seemed like the right kind of practice. It had been with them through everything. "After," he said. "After," Rio agreed. The logistics node was the deepest penetration the swarm had attempted. Kale went in at 0140 with a 6-person team. The node was largely automated. Karath administrative infrastructure ran on minimal physical staff, which was both a reflection of the Karath's capabilities and, incidentally, a vulnerability of exactly the type that had sustained the swarm's operations for 3 years. You didn't need to defeat what you could redirect. The disruption Ironhead's technical team had designed wasn't destructive. It was a set of instructions, precise and minimal, introduced into the node's maintenance scheduling system, telling every component of the northern perimeter grid that its scheduled diagnostic was due. The diagnostic would run. The grid would comply. The wire would retract. Kale reached the node's primary interface at 0153. He had 40 minutes. He used 36 of them. The secondary authentication layer had changed. Not the primary, which matched the intelligence exactly, but a secondary layer that had been updated within the previous month. New protocol. Not in any data they'd worked from. He found the discrepancy at minute 4. He spent minute 5 understanding its architecture. He spent the following 23 minutes solving it. Not with the tools he'd brought for the original authentication, which were now partially wrong, but by working backwards from what the new protocol was apparently trying to achieve, mapping its logic, finding the path through it that the designers had left, because no system can be without a maintenance path, and maintenance paths, if you understood what the designers valued, could be found. He introduced the disruption instructions. He verified the cascade. He ran the verification twice, because twice was the discipline he'd built, and the discipline was why things held. He got out. Rio was at the extraction point, exactly where he was supposed to be, looking at the ground with the concentrated quality of someone managing their own state. Clean, Rio said. Secondary auth had changed. I was inside longer. How long? 36 minutes of a 40-minute window. Rio looked at him. Something in his expression that wasn't quite expression. Clean, Kale said. It's done. Rio exhaled. Not relief exactly. Something more like a breath that had been held at a specific tension and had now been released to the tension appropriate for whatever came next. They moved north together. The coordination point was at the old industrial boundary, the closest stable position to the wire. Ironhead was there, and Sangre, and the full core group, and a mass of zone residents that was larger than Kale had expected. The information had moved further and faster through the zone's networks than any of them had projected, which said something about what 60,000 people did when given an opening, which was moved toward it immediately and without waiting for further confirmation. He stood at the edge of the gathering and looked at it. Families, people carrying specific things. Not the most valuable things they owned, but the most necessary, the most irreplaceable, the things that, when you have to choose in a moment of reckoning, turn out to be the same things regardless of who you are and what you own. Photographs, tools, messen, one or two objects that connect you to who you were before this. He'd watched zone residents before, in the context of sweeps and extractions, and the general daily practice of survival, and he'd always been struck by the particular quality of human presence, even in the most diminished conditions. The way people remained, insistently, themselves. This was a quality amplified to a frequency he couldn't look at directly. Ironhead was standing at the edge of the crowd, with the stillness of a man who has been waiting for something for a very long time, and is now watching it arrive. How long, Kale said. Ironhead looked at his chronometer. 8 minutes. They stood together in the zone's amber-brown dark and watched the mass of people grow and organize itself, the way crowds organized when they had a single clear purpose. Not evenly, not efficiently in the conventional sense, but with a distributed intelligence that produced, collectively, a coherence that no individual had designed. People arranging themselves by family unit, by neighborhood, by the informal networks that zone life had produced. People checking on each other, people who had never met standing close to each other, because close was appropriate to the moment, because the moment required proximity. At 0400, the northern perimeter grid ran its diagnostic. The cascade moved through the system in sequence, component by component, in exactly the order the disruption instructions had specified. The signal mesh powered down. The activation current in the physical barrier dropped to 0. The wire retracted. For a moment, nothing. Then a woman walked through the gap. She walked through with a bag over one shoulder and a child held at her other side, and she looked straight ahead while she walked. Not back, not at the sky, not at anything except the direction she was going. And there was nothing theatrical about it, nothing performed, nothing that invited documentation. She just walked, with the quality of someone who had made a decision and was in the process of executing it, and the decision was irreversible, and she was at peace with it being irreversible. Then another family, then a group of 3, then the movement was simply happening. the natural unstoppable fact of 60,000 people in possession of a gap, and the knowledge that the gap was temporary. They moved through it with the efficiency of water moving through an opening. Not rushing, not panicking, just the fundamental physics of pressure and opening doing what they always did. Cale stood and watched and felt something in his chest that he didn't try to name because naming things sometimes diminished them. And this was not something he wanted diminished. It was the thing Ironhead had been describing with his words about building materials and the things the Karath couldn't model. It was the thing that was somehow simultaneously very small, one gap in one wire on one night in one city, and very large, in the way that things are large when they have been a long time coming. Rio was standing beside him, looking at the movement. His face was doing something complicated that he wasn't trying to control. 48 hours clean, he said. I know, Cale said. The protocol is holding. I know. A silence, then Rio said quietly, whatever comes next, I want to be there for it. You will be, Cale said. I want to be. He paused. Found the word. Reelable. Cale looked at him. At 3 years of the zone in his face. At the particular person those 3 years had made out of the person who had been there before them. You are, he said. They stood together as the crowd moved through the gap. Past them, around them, the zone emptying itself into the larger world, with a patience and a purpose that no one had organized. But that was organizing itself, the way things organize when the conditions are finally right, and the pressure has been sufficient for long enough. After a while, Rio said, do you know what I keep thinking about? Tell me. The Karath have been here 10 years. They cataloged everything. They named everything in the zone. They have taxonomy for every resource, every structure, every threat category. He paused. They don't have a name for this. Cale thought about this. They don't have the concept, he said. No, and that's... Rio stopped. Started again. That's the whole argument, isn't it? That's what Ironhead has been making this whole time. You can't beat a thing you don't have a name for. You can't model a thing you don't have a category for. And they never built the category. Cale looked at the gap in the wire, at the woman who'd gone first, and was now 200 meters past it, still walking, still looking forward, at the mass of people behind her, and beside her, and coming through after her. What do you call it? Rio said. Cale thought about this for a long time. He thought about the barge and grill, and the crucifix, and 3 days in the rubble, and the year before that, and the year before that, and everything the zone had asked, and everything they'd given it, and what it meant to absorb all of that, and still be, standing at the edge of something that was finally going forward. I don't think we need a name, he said. Rio looked at him. We just need to keep doing it, Cale said. Rio held this, the slow nod of someone arriving at a thing rather than being told it. They walked through the wire together. On the other side, the light was wrong, clinical, even the Karath's manufactured illumination of new settlement. Nothing like the amber brown of the zone, colder and harder, and without any of the particular quality that the zone's haze gave to night. It was unfamiliar. It was going to take time to stop being unfamiliar. He could already feel it, the specific work of learning a new normal, the slow replacement of old reference points with new ones. He kept walking. Somewhere in the mass of people behind him, someone was humming. He couldn't make out the tune at this distance, but it had the quality of something very old. Something that had come through the consolidation in the way that Greel had come through it, by not making a fuss, by being too stubborn and too irrelevant to disappear, by simply continuing to be itself, regardless of what had been done to the world around it. He walked forward into the light that wasn't his yet. It will be, he thought. The Karath, when they arrived in force 6 hours later, found the wire section reactivated, their diagnostic systems logging normal function, and 60,000 humans on the wrong side of their perimeter. They ran their standard incident analysis. They ran it a second time when the first has returned inconclusive results. They escalated to the regional administrative tier, which ran a more comprehensive analysis and returned the same inconclusive result. There was no breach incident in the system's taxonomy. There was no threat category that described what the sensor logs showed. The logs showed a maintenance diagnostic, correctly authorized, running on schedule, and in the window of that diagnostic, a quantity of biological units had transitioned from one side of the perimeter to the other. The quantity was outside any modeled scenario. The behavior was outside any modeled behavior. The system's response protocols had no applicable instruction. The variable kept returning null, what the Karath's analysis eventually produced. After 3 rounds of escalation and 17 hours of system review, was a designation that translated roughly into their administrative language as an anomalous compliance event. The diagnostic had run correctly. The perimeter had functioned as designed. The humans had moved through a gap that existed as a scheduled maintenance condition, not a breach. The system had not failed. The system had done precisely what it was designed to do, and in doing so, it had produced an outcome the designers had not modeled, because the designers had not conceived of a population that would be positioned, coordinated, and ready to move the moment a scheduled maintenance window opened. You could not classify it as an attack. There was no attack. You could not classify it as a breach. There was no breach. You could not discipline the system for failure. The system had not failed. You could only note that 60,000 biological units were now on the wrong side of a perimeter, and that reclassifying them as being on the correct side of the perimeter was not operationally feasible, and that the administrative framework for proceeding from this state did not currently exist. The Karath would build that framework. They would adapt. That was the nature of a 10-year occupation by a species with the capabilities the Karath had. They were not static, not incapable of learning, not going to simply accept the outcome and move on. Hard days were coming. Ironhead had said so. Everyone in the swarm knew it. But there was something about the specific quality of the failure. The null result, the anomalous compliance event, the maintenance window that had been exactly what it was designed to be, and had still produced an outcome the entire system had no room for. That felt important to Kale in a way. He turned over. While he walked through New Settlement's unfamiliar light. The Karath had built their perimeter to stop humans from passing through it. They had built it well. The materials were good. The technology was sound. The maintenance protocols were correct. Every parameter functioned within specification. What they had not built for was humans who understood the maintenance schedule well enough to be ready when it ran. You could not defend against knowledge applied with patience. You could not build a perimeter proof against people who had spent 3 years learning everything about the perimeter, not through any special access, but through sustained attention, through the kind of methodical study that came from having nothing else to work with, and deciding that was enough. The Karath had all the technology. The zone's people had time and necessity, and the particular human quality of finding the gap not through brilliance, but through the dogged refusal to accept that there wasn't one. He thought about the woman who had walked through first, the one who hadn't looked back. He didn't know her name. He didn't need to. She was Dara and Vesper, and the old man from the trade cooperative in Greel, and everyone who had spent 10 years in the amber, brown dark, making something out of what was available, which turned out to be enough. It was always enough. That was the thing. It was always exactly enough, because humans had a talent. Ironhead had described it as a building material. Kale thought of it differently, as more like a metabolism, a process of conversion, for taking what was available and turning it into what was needed, not perfectly, not without cost, but persistently, which in the long run was the same as effectively. He was 2 kilometers into New Settlement when Ironhead came to stand beside him. Rio was a few steps to his left, watching the crowd distribute through the streets with the focused attention he brought to operational situations, as if he was scanning it for threat patterns and finding none, and not quite knowing what to do with the absence. "There'll be a response," Ironhead said. "Yes," Kale said. "Hard days ahead." "There have always been hard days," Rio said. Ironhead looked at him, something in his expression that was, briefly and without performance, something that looked like what warmth looked like, when a person who didn't display it freely let it be visible for a moment. "How are you doing?" he said to Rio, the specific question. 48 hours clean, Rio said. "The protocol is holding." Ironhead nodded. He looked at Kale. Then he looked at both of them together, which was its own kind of look. The look of a man who has been assessing something for months and has arrived at his assessment. "The remaining 6 facilities," he said. "We have the locations. We have more people now than when we started. We have the Karath operating without a model for what we're doing, which is its own form of advantage." He paused. "Are you ready?" he said. It was a question that was also a statement. Kale heard it as both. He looked at New Settlement streets, filling with zone people who were doing the particular human thing of taking whatever was available and making it theirs. He looked at Rio, who was watching the same thing with the expression of someone who has come through the far side of a hard passage and found themselves, improbably, still standing. He thought about the next 6 operations, the next 6 sets of faces, the next 6 moments of standing at a door and watching what happened when it opened. He thought about the shape of what came after all of it, the shape he couldn't yet see clearly because it was still being built. "Yes," Kale said. Kale was 2 kilometers inside New Settlement when the swarm's sensor network flagged the first signal of the Karath response forming to the north. He was sitting on a piece of Karath-built infrastructure with Rio beside him, watching the crowd distribute through the streets and open spaces of New Settlement, finding every available space, filling it, making it occupied, making it human. The distribution had a natural quality. People organizing around resources, around each other, on the small, immediate needs of being somewhere new, and needing to understand where things were. It was the same organizational intelligence that had produced the zone's informal systems, now applied to a different environment, making it home. Ironhead came to stand with them. He looked at the crowd for a long time without speaking. "There'll be a response," he said. "Yes," Kale said. "Hard days ahead." "There have always been hard days," Rio said. Ironhead looked at him. Something in his expression that was, briefly and without performance, something that looked like what warmth looked like, when a person who didn't display it freely let it be visible for a moment. "How are you doing?" he said to Rio. The specific question. 48 hours clean, Rio said. "The protocol is holding." Ironhead nodded. He looked at KL. Then he looked at both of them together, which was its own kind of look. The look of a man who has been assessing something for months and has arrived at his assessment. "The remaining 6 facilities," he said. "We have the locations. We have more people now than when we started. We have the Karath, operating without a model for what we're doing, which is its own form of advantage." He paused. "Are you ready?" he said. It was a question that was also a statement. Kale heard it as both. He looked at New Settlement streets, filling with zone people, who were doing the particular human thing of taking whatever was available and making it theirs. He looked at Rio, who was watching the same thing with the expression of someone who has come through the far side of a hard passage and found themselves, improbably, still standing. "Yes," Kale said. He meant it the way Rio had taught him to mean things, over 3 years of learning together what it meant to mean something fully, without the hedges that fear used to add, without the constant background calculation of what would be taken back. He meant it as a commitment to the next thing, and the thing after that, and everything after that, until the calculus finally shifted enough to matter. The Karath would respond. There would be hard days. There were always hard days. He was still here. That was the entire argument, in the end. Not the operations, or the intelligence, or the planning, or the archive modules, or the 12 to 24-hour window, or any specific element of 3 years of accumulation. All of those things were real, and all of them mattered, and none of them were the foundation. The foundation was simpler and older, and more stubborn than any of it. He was still here. He was going to keep being here, and every morning there would be more of him. The Karath had come with their models and their taxonomies and there's comprehensive architecture of control. And in all of that architecture, they had built no room for a species that absorbed what had been done to it, and kept building anyway, that turned loss into material, that found a gap and walked through it with a child on one hip and a bag on one shoulder, not looking back. They had no category for it. They were going to need to build one. Cale thought, walking through the Careth's clean and unfamiliar light, that by the time they built it, it would be too late. He thought this not with triumph, not with the performed satisfaction that would have been dishonest to the weight of everything it had cost, but with the particular quiet certainty of a person who has understood something that cannot be ununderstood. The way the zone looked in the morning, under its amber haze, with the waterprint catching what light was available and giving it back. The way Greel sat in his chair, the way 3 days in the rubble produced, against all probability, a shape that held, the way things survived the ocean without losing what they were. He walked forward,